I started to think about my new book in last February. It was before Brexit, and it was before the US presidential elections. But you could already, I would say, you could already feel and see that the very fundaments of liberal democracies had been challenged, and that there is something, I would say, some political, geological tensions in Western societies. Some weeks later, in April 2016, Anne Applebaum, the Polish-American writer, published a piece in the Washington Post. The core message was the West, not as a geopolitical but as a normative political project, is just 3 elections apart from its self-destruction. And she named the Brexit referendum. It was before it took place in June. The American presidential elections, and then the French presidential elections. And we know the outcome of 2 of these 3. And even, and I'm still quite optimistic that Marine Le Pen will not make the race in the second round of the French elections. This is no reason to lean back and for relief. I think we are really in a very fundamental crisis of the liberal democratic not only government but the whole societal fabric. And you can maybe get an idea of how dramatic changes have been over the last 25 years if those of you who are old enough remember the days of 1989, 1990. You know, this, as a German and as a European, you know, this almost euphoric experience of these peaceful democratic revolutions in Central Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this was the famous Fukuyama moment when Francis Fukuyama published his thesis on the end of history. The end of history, of course, he didn't mean that now everything will remain like it is, but the deeper sense of this thesis was that there is no systemic competition anymore. No, we had a historical breakthrough of liberal democracy, or the combination of liberal democracy and capitalism, market-based economies. And this more or less now is the future for the whole world. And these post-communist societies, the term for these societies had been transition societies, and the meaning of transition was they are coming from a totalitarian past and they are heading to a democratic future. And this kind of prediction, of course, turned out as extremely unhistoric. And we are now confronted with a very different landscape, with more and more self-assertive authoritarian regimes which no longer see themselves as these kind of transition societies, but who establish kind of authoritarian rule of itself, And we still lack of, I would say, kind of a precise theory to describe this the emergence of new authoritarian governance in China, in Russia, in Iran, now also in Turkey. Turkey heading from a, I would say, more a democracy with some flaws to a full-fledged authoritarian regime. And we see these developments also within the European Union. If you look into Hungary or to Poland, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Mr. Orban, he adopted the phrase of the illiberal democracy, which I would say is a contradiction in itself, a kind of oxymoron. So, but very, I would say, very self-assertive, very offensive. Yeah, not being ashamed about that. It's so we see ourselves as an alternative to the decadent and dysfunctional liberal democracies of the West. And this is the political language also from a European angle, very much from Russia. Russia has become a kind of headquarter of an anti-liberal international with very deep financial and political networks to right-wing and left-wing populist parties and movements in Europe. And at the same time, now we are facing this challenge from within our own societies. Of course, for us, it was a kind of shock, the outcome of the US elections. But if you think twice, it's not so different from what's happening in Europe, where you see all over the place the rise of xenophobic, anti-liberal, nationalistic forces. And not only what you may assume in the countries which are plagued by economic crisis and high youth unemployment and social insecurity, you find it also in Scandinavia, for instance. Still very functioning welfare states with a high degree of welfare, public welfare, and private prosperity of large majority of the societies. You find it in the Netherlands, and you find it to a certain degree also in Germany, although I have to say that Germany still is a kind of anchor of stability in Europe, both in economic and in political terms. And the breakthrough of the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany party, I would say it's maybe it's still over its peak, and probably they will struggle to reach 10% or so in the next elections. So this is still a difference. I would say it's still a more marginal phenomenon. If you compare it to France, where Marine Le Pen probably will come out with 35 or 40% of the votes in the second round of the presidential election. In France, the motherland of the Declaration of Civil and Human Rights in Europe, following the Declaration of Independence in America, which obviously had been really interdependent and then connected events. So I would say still the West, is we have not only a common past, and we have a common normative platform, a common normative fundament for our politics and the way our societies are built. So what's going on? What's going on? Of course, we can blame these populist and right-wing extremists from morning until the night, but that will not help much. I think we have to ask ourselves what went wrong in our own societies and in our own politics over the last 25, 30 years. And my reading of this anti-liberal and anti-elitist revolt we are seeing all over the place in the West is reflecting what I would name a crisis of modernization. Over the since 1990, we have seen an acceleration of fundamental change in all dimensions in our societies. One, of course, the major changes we are confronted with is globalization. For the first time, we have a real global economy, an integrated, interconnected global economy. And on the one side, for me, this is a very positive thing, because it could build the base for a kind of a global civil society. Global exchange of ideas, of people, of goods, but at the same time, it has created more economic vulnerability and volatility. And if you are looking back, I think the financial crisis from 2007, 2008 has been the mother of all crises in the West. It created a sense of that things are running out of control. And the loss of control is one of the major sources for these anti-liberal movements. In Britain, the main slogan for the Brexit campaign was, "Let's take back control." Let's take back control over our borders, over our economies, over our national fate. Yeah, let's take back control. And as far as I understood the campaign of Donald Trump, it was quite similar. Yeah. So this impression that globalization led to a loss of control over the economy, and that there is a gap between the globalization of the economy and political regulation, which is still very much linked to the national state. So I would say we have a kind of governance gap, yeah, between the global integration of financial markets and the economy at large, and the governance system, which is still based on the national state. And I think this is one of the sources of the crisis. Global migration, of course, is another one, which we, if I'm allowed to use this kind of collective we saw it, and I still see it, basically as something positive. So diversity as a productive force, yeah, in increasing the innovation capacity, and making our societies more complex, more interesting, and of course, opening millions and millions of people new opportunities by migrating, striving for improving their lives and the lives of their children. But at the same time, I think we had been a little bit ignorant that for parts of our society, similar as economic globalization, this is not just a win-win game. They see it as a threat. as a cultural threat and also as a social economic threat. You know, more competition, especially for, you know, the lower parts of the labor market. A third element, and this also is part of this new wave of modernization, of course, is the digital revolution. And we only have seen, I would say, the early stages. Digital revolution will change our economies and our societies fundamentally. And especially in Germany, I think it's a little bit different from the United States. The discourse on the digital revolution is a discourse of fear. Yeah? Again, people feel threatened. So digital, the replacement of human beings by intelligent machines. Well, this is the big picture of how the digital revolution is perceived by a majority of our societies. And to name a fourth very fundamental change, a true revolution, of course, this is a cultural revolution which happened, it started already in the 60s in our societies, but it became kind of a new push in the last 20 years, gender revolution, the crisis and the dissolution of the patriarchal family, which created a crisis of male identity. And again, if I read it right, you know, the support for Donald Trump was very much about white male working class. And then, of course, what has been following the next waves of this kind of gender revolution, the whole LGBTI movement, this kind of identity politics. So I think this also created then a sense of shifting grounds. And challenging of kind of basic security, not only in the sense of social security, but also of mental security. And as in previous stages of industrial modernity, I think there is kind of basic, almost a basic law that if you have periods of acceleration of modernization, you have this kind of anti-modern movements. And you could find a lot of ideological similarities if you're looking to Europe in the end of the 19th century and in the period after the First World War, and this anti-liberal revolt than nowadays. It is anti-globalization. In economic terms, it's economic protectionism. Yeah. It is anti-immigration and the idea of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. In German, you have this idea of Volksgemeinschaft. Volksgemeinschaft, the unity of the people, defined by ethnic and cultural terms. And it was not only a Nazi term, it's a much broader tradition in our thinking. It is anti-parliamentarian. The idea of people's democracy opposed to representative parliamentarian democracy. You can find it even in very prominent political thinkers like Carl Schmitt, who was the most prominent political thinker in the Weimar Republic, a republic of the conservative right. And he was one of the strongest critics of parliamentarism. In his view, parliamentarism is only a mechanical system. And the true sense of democracy is the unity between political leadership and the people. So you can have democracy without parliamentarism. And these kind of ideas are flourishing then again. So I think we have to be aware that this is not just a superficial crisis we are confronted with. It's going deeper. And of course, to come to some provisional conclusions, we have to ask, how could we, the liberal democratic crowd, how could we address these root causes of anti-liberal resentments and revolts in a different way? We cannot ignore them. And maybe it is part of our fault that we took a blind eye to the worries and concerns and the unrest of people who felt disconnected and who see themselves on the loser side of globalization and cultural modernization and digital revolution. And we have been in a kind of ivory tower, the liberals. So we have to be serious about these root causes of this unrest and the upheaval, but look for different answers to deal with it, strengthening liberal democracy instead of undermining it then even more. And I'll just briefly go through some of the ideas I've been arguing with in my new book. I think one lesson and one important message is institutions matter. Democratic, republican institutions matter, not only in the terms of the classical liberal institutions, free and fair elections and division of power and independence of judiciary and a free press. Of course, these are the basic fundamentals. The check of balance system, guarantors of individual liberty. But in a broader sense, republican institutions, the public good. And maybe this is even more an issue in the United States than in Europe. For instance, the public educational system. Education is a key issue in several dimensions. For a knowledge-based society, of course, education is the most important asset for individuals to keep pace with the fundamental changes, economic, technological, societal changes we are confronted with, but also in terms of societal and political participation. And the educational system is core for the promise of equal opportunities. And the promise of equal opportunities is in the very center of the liberal promise. And if we are serious, we have been going in the wrong direction over the last decades. We have less than opportunities for lower class young ones. So public institutions, or I would say republican institutions in a very broad sense, including culture, and even public transport. Interestingly, public transport has been a source of, I would say, kind of citizens' pride in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If I'm arriving in Washington at Union Station or at Central Station in New York, you can see that. Why did people build railway stations like castles or like a palace? Yeah, it is far beyond only a functional design. It is a matter of public pride. It's we the people. Yeah? Democracies need a kind of public representation. And these public institutions, these are, this is kind of a source of belonging. We as a society. So I think we have to invest much more in these public institutions than we did over the last decades. If I'm looking to Germany, which of course I'm more familiar with, now the austerity policy, reducing public debt, has not been done by cutting social spendings. No, it's not true. The ratio of social spending in the public budget even rose over the last 20 years. It has been done by reduction of public investment. And this is going to create a crisis of public infrastructure. And if I'm coming to the United States, I feel it much more dramatically. The crisis of public infrastructure, of the public good. So I think this is one of the major answers in different dimensions. From empowerment of individuals, empowerment of people to deal with the dramatic changes we are confronted with, to creating this kind of a republican we. Not a nationalistic or ethnic we, no, a republican we, the people. I would like to add another element, I think, especially for Europe, which is even more struggling with an economic crisis than the United States. Beyond Germany, we need a kind of revitalization of our economies, and not in the old-fashioned way, not going back to the 70s or 80s, but in a future-oriented way, greening our economies. And looking at the environmental challenge, climate change and resource crisis and all these phenomena as an opportunity for a new industrial revolution. Creating or re-engineering our energy system, our transport system, our cities, creating a new wave of innovation and technologies and services, and offering new opportunities for young people. So I think we have also to look for new kind of economic dynamics, bridging the environmental and economic concerns, and creating a new sense of confidence. Because the main, I would say, emotional currency of the anti-liberals is fear. It's fear of the future. And then their answer is, we should shield ourselves. We should shield ourselves against globalization. We should shield ourselves against migrants. We should build a fortress. a fortress to defend the status quo. And we know that the status quo is not sustainable. So our answer should be kind of a new narrative of progress. What is our view, our vision of progress for the 21st century? And the deeper meaning of open society, a phrase we know from Karl Popper, one of the major liberal thinkers of the last century, the deeper meaning of open society is that we are confident that the future is open. The future is open as a space we can define. And not just a threat, which is coming up upon us. So, thank you very much.
Okay.